Welcome to another episode. I know you're asking questions. I have to look at my notes as I'm reading this. Are you considering financing your home purchase and you want to know the ins and outs, basically when it comes to real estate joint ventures? Well, today's episode, that's what we'll be discussing. We have a special guest today. I'm going to introduce Peter Goodman. Peter, how you doing?
How are you doing today?
Cannot complain. Let's just dive deep into this because I know people are actually, as we're doing this, we're getting live questions. I guess number one question is, what exactly is a joint venture?
So a joint venture is really just what it sounds like. It's two or more people that are getting involved, and we're talking more about obviously about real estate today. So that if you're two partners that are buying property, generally it's for an investment purpose to make money, whether it be to buy and flip property or to hold property for rental or other types of income.
Okay. And could you give us an example of the different legal structures available for real estate joint ventures, and how does somebody choose the best one for this specific project?
So there are lots of ways that people do them, but the most common, look, you can do a simple partnership, which is the old way. It's old school. Nobody really does that anymore. What most people do today is an LLC. That's a limited liability company. Most people buy properties in a limited liability company. You can also do an S corp. There's a lot of debate. Some people, there are benefits and negatives of each. Some people choose the LLC. Some people choose the S corp. And of course, you can do a C corp too. An S corp really has pass-through tax advantages. New York City does not recognize S corps, but an S corp and an LLC are similar in many ways, but what an S corp is for a smaller investment with 2, 3, or 4 people, as opposed to a C corp, which is what major companies do, like Coca-Cola and Apple. So, but an LLC is pretty much the gold standard in New York. What we see buyers are doing joint ventures and they're buying real estate.
All right, so I guess the next follow-up question would be, are there any legal requirements for doing a joint venture?
Yeah, well, you have to file with the state. So both corporations and LLCs are set up with a filing. You pay for the filing, you get a filing receipt. You're going to need an EIN, a tax ID number. You're going to need, when you structure it, depending on who. So with both corporations and LLCs, if you get sued, you need to let the Secretary of State know who process should be served on, because the problem with a lot of people that don't really think about this, or they use a registered agent and they don't keep up with it, is somebody sues the corporation or the LLC, they notify the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State sends stuff to the last known address, and then you never get it and you end up getting a default judgment against you. So you need to make sure you have your registration correct with the Secretary of State, with the Department of State. You also, if it's a limited liability company, you need to publish. So that requires you to publish for 6 weeks in a local periodical. You're going to, depending on the county, the cost could be different. We're talking about New York here, and the county filing is going to be different because of the publication on the limited liability company, but you need to have a principal place of business that you're going to direct, and you need to direct whether how many shares if you're doing corporation, and if you're doing an LLC, you need to mention how many members you're going to have, because they're going to treat you differently depending on whether you're a sole member LLC or a multiple member LLC.
Okay. I guess the next question I have is, can you discuss the financial obligations for each party when it comes to a joint venture, and how should they document what they're doing basically legally?
So great. It's a great question. So the financial obligations are what you invest, right? It's how much capital you put in. The differences, and we talk more about S corps versus LLCs, is really the decision you're going to make and how that financing obligation is different. But initially, you're going to invest initial capital. Each member, if it's an LLC, is going to invest a certain amount of money, and your membership interests generally will reflect how much money you put in. So in an LLC, you may have 40% of the membership interest and your other partner has 60%. And it may be based on the capital. It doesn't have to be based on how much you invest, but generally that's the way you're going to do it. With an S corp, you're buying shares, so you're going to buy whatever amount of shares that you buy, and that's going to be your initial capital investment. That's how you're going to fund it. One thing I want to just back up for a second on the legal requirements we talked about earlier is if you're doing an S corp and it's in New York City, I just wanted to mention New York City does not recognize S corporations, so there is an additional tax. Normally, what happens is a general corporation tax that you avoid by doing an S corp over a C corp. Meaning, the nice thing about both LLCs and S corps, ideally, is that you don't have double taxation. The corporation has a pass through, so you're only paying income tax based on your income from that corporate structure, as opposed to paying corporate tax and then having to pay the income tax. New York City requires you to pay the general corporation tax. You'll still get the savings on the federal and the state, but you won't get it on the city. So it's something you should be aware of. But in terms of investment, it's as much as you need for the project, and then you have to decide between yourselves, meaning the joint venture partners, how much you're each going to invest and what that's going to mean in terms of how you're going to share in the duties and the profits.
All right, that's very interesting. I think the next segment, I guess we want to talk about is dispute resolutions. What dispute resolutions mechanisms should we be including in the real estate joint venture agreements?
Okay, so this is a question that is essentially the conversation I have with most of my clients. A lot of people, they try to set up these S corps or the LLCs through. You always look for the cheapest method, and there's an old saying, being penny wise and pound foolish. So they go to the companies, like the Legal Zooms out there, the non-lawyer companies that you just file an LLC or an S corp, and they don't really think about it. If you're doing a single member, it's just you. Okay, I get it. Unless you have a split personality, you're not going to fight with yourself. Right? But,
hopefully not.
But if you're a partnership, meaning it's a joint venture, which is the subject of this conversation, and you have a corporation, you're going to have a shareholder agreement. If you have an LLC, you're going to have an operating agreement. Both of them, I tell clients, that is your agreement between the parties. That's your partnership agreement. I mean, more than anything else, it's going to define what's going to happen, what your voting rights are, what you can do, how you're going to make income or divide income. But extremely important is dispute resolution. It's like whenever people start a business together, everything is great. You love your partner, right? You want to
honeymoon phase.
Right, it is, because you're going into this business. You guys think you're going to make great money. You have a nice personal relationship, ideally, with the person that you're going into partnership with. We're talking about smaller partnerships, 1 to 10 people, that type of stuff. And nobody expects what's going to happen if it's a fight. But I can tell you, we do a lot of litigation in our office, and a lot of times it comes down to people do not agree on how they're going to sell their real estate, how they're going to manage their real estate, what they're going to do with tenants, what they're going to do with financing. And then invariably it comes to, I'll say, well, I see your operating agreement. And they'll say, we don't have an operating agreement. Or they got the standard one that came with the online company that they used, which really doesn't have dispute resolution clauses, or it doesn't really discuss it. And that becomes a problem, because now you've saved, $500 maybe on using the online company to set up your entity, but now you're spending thousands of dollars in litigation costs because you didn't agree with your partner, and there's no good way to resolve a dispute. Now, there are lots of dispute resolution mechanisms that you can put in agreements. For instance, you can, if someone wants to sell their shares or their interests, and someone else doesn't want them to be able to just sell it to anyone else because they don't want to inherit a partner they don't want, you can have a right of first refusal. So the remaining partners can have the option to buy you out. You can have, if there is, ideally, you have 3 partners, right? So you have, you may have each, you have to have 2/3 vote, let's say, right? So you can always agree at the beginning that as long as 2 of us agree with a move, then that's the vote, 2/3. Or you can do a unanimous vote on certain really, so about let's say you want to dissolve the business, you want to sell the real estate, you can make that a unanimous vote, and you can make basic decisions a 2/3 or majority vote. You can also have arbitration clauses. So instead of having to go to court and sue if there's a problem, you can require a dispute to be done by some kind of a mediation, alternative dispute resolution, some kind of an arbitration. But all of those things, having them pre-loaded into your agreement, that is going to save you time, headache, and lots of money if and when there is a dispute. You have to. I always say
this is life. There's always
when at some point, look. Ideally, it's going to be the best investment in the world, and you're going to make so much money, and you're never going to have a fight. But that's not reality.
And here's the thing. For people who are watching this right now, I want you to understand, if you're a family member and you're going into business with your family, you should definitely talk to a professional about this. If you're friends, if this is your spouse, significant other, basically you're planning to do this, you should definitely sit down with a professional. Whether it's friends, family, or whatever the situation, or a regular business partner, you should definitely have these conversations. Talk to the professionals, iron out everything, have the dispute conversation, have the exit clause conversation, have an agreement, and just be prepared, because stuff happens all the time. You might, like you said, this might be the honeymoon phase right now. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, a couple of weeks from now, or a month or a year from now. So you want to have these conversations, and if you don't avoid these conversations, everybody knows exactly what's going to happen if something does happen. You have an answer for everything. And
absolutely,
worst case scenario, you have your professional who you hired, your attorney, your CPA, your realtor, whoever the case may be. You use their expertise basically to help you with whatever your situation is. So I guess we kind of touched upon the exit strategy. So do you want to talk about what the legal considerations should be taken for in this account if people decide they want to dissolve the partnership?
You want to dissolve, so if one person wants to keep the real estate and one person wants to sell, again, we talked about a right of first refusal, but things that people should know, the finer details can be important. What I've seen a lot of people try to do and not realize that they can't. They own, let's say, a limited liability company, and they say, you know what, we own this building. I'm just going to give my 50% or 60% membership interest to this other person. I'm going to sell it to them, and it's a private transaction. But it's not, because New York State states that any property that is sold where 50% of the interest or the fair market value is changing hands, they consider that a transfer of real estate, and then you have to pay transfer taxes on that. New York City, you may know, has a large transfer tax potentially, and New York State always has a transfer tax, and it also depends to some extent on the sales price and the fair market value. So you need to have those considerations. If you're going to, if one person wants to get out and one person wants to stay in, you should be aware of how that may affect you and who's going to pay those costs when they arise. Because if one person wants to leave and the other person wants to stay, the person that wants to stay may say, well, why do I have to contribute to any of these transfer taxes? You should pay that. You're the seller, right? So sometimes those arguments can come up, and if you plan for them in your agreements, in your operating agreements or your shareholder agreements, you can resolve them. I mean, there are tons of those types of issues. What happens if someone gets sick and is mentally unable to function anymore, or someone dies? Those issues and what happens to their interests are critical for your agreements. I mean, you don't want to all of a sudden be partners with one of your partner's spouses necessarily, right? Because someone passed away. So you want to have those structures in place and have vehicles that will allow you to define how that would work.
That's an interesting point that you brought up. I didn't even think about that. I'm glad you mentioned that. This kind of ties into what we're talking about right now. Let's talk about risk management. What are some of the common legal risks associated with a real estate joint venture?
So it's good. So let's start with why you do a joint venture in the first place into a corporation or LLC. You do it to avoid liability. So if I own a house, if you and I own a house together in a corporation or limited liability company, well, if someone hurts themselves if that house falls off the roof, all the paint, doing the roof, working on the roof or something, and sues, they can only sue and get their whatever judgment they may be entitled to will only come from the asset that the LLC owns, which is the house or the building, whatever that building is. They cannot go after you personally, so it protects you significantly against that kind of personal liability. So liability protection is one of the most common reasons to own property in a corporate entity, but also structuring it to think about how to limit that liability. If you own, let's say, 4 houses now, you're building this business and you're continuing to build it, and you're making more and more money, so you're buying more and more property and you're managing them. Well, there are lots of structures for that. One, you may want to have a holding company that's an LLC, so LLCs can own other LLCs, and you can have shares to some extent. Shareholders also can be potentially LLCs. There's interplay between the corporations and the LLCs, which is a little beyond the scope of this conversation. But the point being that you hear about holding companies, you may want to just have an LLC or a corporate entity that just owns all these other properties. So now each property has potentially its own LLC, like an umbrella, like a parent subsidiary. Yeah. Each LLC has its own building. So now each building is its own separate structure. So if someone falls at one building, it doesn't affect all the other buildings. But because you want to have it all tied together, it's a good idea oftentimes to have one umbrella LLC, and then under each one there is a separate corporate entity. So that is a good way to limit that risk. One of the things that we also encourage you to do is to treat your corporation or your LLC as an LLC. Now, this is something that people don't really think about. They create these corporate entities and they didn't get any guidance, and now so they have a corporation. They don't have an annual meeting. They have LLCs, and they start paying the stuff out of their personal bank account because they need a capital infusion, and they just write a check out of their personal bank account. Those are big problems, because when someone sues, and there's a limited amount of asset, because let's say it's just the building, right, and that's all they can collect, because there's a lot of money in a potential lawsuit that they can get a judgment against. Well, if you didn't treat your corporation or your LLC as an LLC, there's something called piercing the corporate veil. So now all of a sudden, and we're doing this right now. I have a case right now where we're trying to pierce the corporate veil against another company that was a restaurant, and we found out that the restaurant had multiple companies, and they were using money from one to feed another, and they were using money from this personal account to feed another, and they were buying. They never had meetings. They didn't file tax returns the right way. They didn't have. They weren't paying their franchise taxes. So all of those things are going into our argument as to why this person can be sued personally now, because they didn't treat their corporation as a separate entity. And so those are the liability strategies that you want to start thinking about. When you own a business, you should treat it like a business.
I like what you said. Basically, everything you just said, that last segment, pretty much sums up this whole purpose of these videos. Is we want to give people information so they know exactly what they're doing and seek professional help when it comes to this stuff. Yes, you can go to LegalZoom, but you're not going to get the experience. Basically, that in itself pays for you not to have headaches. You can YouTube a lot of things, but you need to sit down with somebody who has experience, that does this day in and day out. This is all that they do. You need to talk to a professional, and that way they can, you can avoid a lot of pitfalls if you talk to a professional and let them know what you.
I make a lot of money on people that go to those companies and they have a problem later on, because unraveling it afterwards is usually more expensive than doing it right the first time.
It's that old saying, basically, you can do the work yourself, and then you're gonna end up paying the professional to fix the mess that you made. So do it right the first time. I think the next thing that we wanted to talk about, you kind of mentioned this with the case. I was going to mention a case study or give me an example. We kind of discussed that already. So I guess the next step would be the future trends. How do you see the legal landscape for real estate joint ventures evolving in New York? And what should potential investors or soon-to-be investors be aware of?
Well, I don't see any major changes right now coming other than that. Look, a lot of people used to use limited liability companies for anonymity, and New York is one of the world leaders in actually hiding assets through limited liability companies. And I think 60 Minutes a few years back did a story about that. So they've made it so when you transfer real estate in a limited liability company, you have to disclose the social security number. It's a lot harder to get the anonymity that you used to have in sheltering these properties and in holding companies. There's also new requirements for corporate entities because of the Financial Crimes Unit of the United States government, the FinCEN. So they have you have to now provide identifying information. So if you're getting into these structures for not just the financial benefits, but also to try to have some anonymous ownership, you need to think about some of those structures as well, and what those requirements are. But most of the changes usually come in the form of different types of taxation and different types of tax benefits that you're going to have. Liability becomes more of a concern if, and again, a little beyond the scope of this conversation, but if you're buying properties that are rent stabilized or multi-unit properties, there's been a lot of changes to the rent stabilization laws, particularly in New York City, but it changes how you're going to look at the profitability, and profitability becomes a very important consideration. Real estate taxes go up, transfer taxes go up, corporate taxes go up, but depending on the administration and depending on the need for the governmental entities to raise revenue, that's where you're going to start to see. We always see changes, but it's a very hot topic now. If you just Google rent stabilization in New York or in New York City, you're going to find all sorts of articles about how it has affected the profitability of joint ventures in owning these types of properties.
All right, Peter, thank you so much, basically, for your time putting all this together. My last question, well, it's not really a question, it's kind of a statement. But before we go, I want to, if anybody has any questions regarding anything that we discussed, or they want to know more about real estate legal aspects, or they have questions or scenarios that they want to discuss with you, how can they reach you?
Oh, great. So you can call my office or you can email. We have offices in New York City and Long Island, but we work really throughout New York. The phone number is 718-934-8811, which can reach both Long Island or the city. And the email address is the general one is RE as in real estate at bfslawfirm.com. That's B as in boy, F as in Frank, S as in Sam, lawfirm.com. And I tell everybody also, I'm a partner in a firm. I manage the real estate department, but real estate's not a vacuum, or is business. We handle bankruptcy, we handle matrimonial, we handle litigation, we handle landlord-tenant, and we handle real estate and basic estates. So we do all those areas, and what's important about that is when you're considering doing your transactions, all or some of those areas of practice will often be an issue that you have to discuss, that has to be considered in that joint venture or other type of purchase.
All right. I'm Evan Saint-Gerard with Keller Williams Realty Landmark. If you have any questions about buying, selling, or investing in real estate, feel free to give me a call. Speaking about investing in real estate, because we are talking about joint ventures, we will be doing a series regarding investments, basically how to get into the investment game, how to start, and stuff like that. Now, hopefully, Peter, if he's available, will be one of the people that we can discuss how to start. This is kind of the tip of the iceberg that we're discussing right now. So the last thing I want to say to people, well, you can find me on all social media before I forget. Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok. I'm not dancing, but I'm on TikTok, and a few other things, YouTube as well, and Facebook. You can find me on all those social media presence. Our website is mynyhomesales.com, which you'll probably see this video on there, and also on YouTube, pretty much everywhere. And then my phone number is 917-975-5985. Our office number is 718-475-2760. Peter, the last question or statement that I have for you is, what advice could you give to someone? Basically, just sum it up in as fast as you can. Uh, what advice would you give to somebody who's considering joint ventures? Basically, what should they keep in mind? And
Good question. Summary is make sure that you have an agreement, whether it's an operating agreement, a shareholders agreement. Make sure you have the right team in place. You have your attorney, you have your accountant, but you need to make sure that the agreement that you set up when you first start the process dictates how you're going to run your business, so you can plan for the future and make sure that you have the most successful business possible. I wish you guys all the best of luck and happy investing.